we're just playing the two different kinds of football. They have totally different rules. And China is not moving forward as a nation thinking that, oh, at every stage we have to be able to make money. No, no, we have to just win. And that's why you see that the Chinese government is outperforming the US government, the European Union, because they're not arguing about are we playing nice in the open market. They're just saying we're investing government funding many billions of dollars every year. And this has been a sustained effort in China for a decade or 2 decades. They showed up with a soccer ball and we showed up with football pads on, and we're just complaining that they don't want to play our game.
You've heard a lot about electric vehicles. Here's a twist you probably didn't see coming. Georgia, right here in the South, is leading the country in EV manufacturing investment. From the factory floor to your driveway, we'll connect the dots between innovation, industry, and everyday life. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to our conversation with Bill Mustain, Director at the Carolina Institute for Battery Innovation. If you haven't listened to part one of this conversation, I recommend you listen to it first before continuing this episode. Last episode, we laid out the foundation of what the battery belt is and how data centers are reshaping demand. Now back to our conversation with Bill.
So let's talk more about the battery research and critical minerals part of this. So when we talk about battery research today, especially from your vantage point, running a center that's primarily focused on batteries, what is actually moving the needle in your opinion? Is it the chemistry innovation, the process engineering, the material science, or is it systems integration, or some
Yeah,
combination of all of the above?
yeah, that would certainly be the cop-out answer. It would be, Gabby, you're right, it's all of them. But
All of them.
I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, and this is not meant to make anybody, especially academics, depressed, because when you think about what's really happening in industry right now, in like big US manufacturers like Panasonic, Tesla, right? If you look at their chemistry and materials innovation, it's not actually that every year they're coming out with a new cathode, a new anode, right? That we're
Yeah.
still talking about, some folks are graphite anodes, some graphite with a sprinkle of silicon in them, right, to just temporarily boost capacity. Again, we have LFP and NMC, but what is the innovation that's happening while still affording reliability? It's traditional engineering optimization. We're trying to slightly reduce the amount of additive in the cathode material to increase the cell level energy density. We're changing the particle size distribution within a chemistry in order to get better packing when you're doing calendaring, right? So your like volumetric density improves just by 1%. And 1% improvement on these things might not sound like a lot to people, but it could be many millions of dollars. And like someone gets a promotion if you save 0.1% of additive. So
I know any better yield helps because scale is the
exactly.
issue.
Exactly. This is like, people complain about oil companies making so much money, but like the margins really aren't that high if you look at them, but it's just you make it up in volume, and this is what you can do here as well. So from a manufacturing and industry perspective, it's very rare that a technology comes in that really disrupts what's happening and you're going along a development pathway that you've been going along for a really long time, and I think that's fine. When you talk about research, though, I really highly encourage academics, especially at universities, right? We're supposed to be the brain trust thinking about what's going to happen, not even 5 years from now, because the things that are in cells 5 years from now already exist, right? So we
Oh,
need to
yeah.
be
They just need to get commercialized is really the issue.
exactly. Somehow someone has to drag you over the valley of death, right? And so you need to have like a 10, 15-year view. And if you're going to have that view, whether it's best systems or EVs, that's why a lot of universities are collaborating with industries, and we're working on things you hear about all the time, right? Like solid state, lithium, sulfur. You're talking about sodium-based chemistries. You're even talking about how do you get into like zinc-based batteries again that aren't just primary alkaline batteries um, or hearing aid batteries, but now you have flowable zinc systems, which are super interesting. And I really think academics need to be thinking about how do we, at the fundamental research level, TRL1, create new materials, new chemistries, And we're going to help sort that out. And most are going to fail. And that's great. And actually, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And then you're going to have folks that are working on the applications end that help some of these big companies to like overcome a problem. And maybe that's and some automated materials discovery using AI. Maybe it's a bug in a battery management system. So we're doing some of that at USC, and other universities are doing that as well. But I think from a research side, yeah, I mean, if you're in a company, you should be doing optimization, reducing cost, and then collaborate with universities that are doing like really weird fundamental science, chemistry, materials work.
So critical minerals. How central do you think critical minerals are to the next phase of battery competitiveness? Very, very flashy in the news right now, especially because DC a couple weeks ago had all of those folks in for these, preferential agreements that they're trying to form a super block that's almost like a Western critical minerals pact
Yep.
on a lot of this. Do you think that we're actually facing a materials constraint, a processing constraint? So is this an upstream or a downstream critical minerals problem, or is this just geopolitics?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I think critical minerals are obviously going to be super, super important. We just talked about there's very few foundational changes in the chemistry that's going to happen in the foreseeable 5, 10 years, right? So nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, these are all super important for us to make sure that we have access to. But we already talked earlier in the podcast about the fact that we've built in, we globally, not we as Western nations, an over capacity for mining, materials processing, material supply, and cell manufacturing. We know globally that already exists, that we have an oversupply. So that's not really the issue. The issue is certainly a geopolitical one, is that are you willing to have something that we consider so fundamental to our growth, like batteries for X, and that's whether you want to talk about for things like data centers and implementation, like we talk about, whether it's the military applications, directed energy weapons, unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, right? Or unmanned underwater vehicles. So these are all super important things that we want to be able to control the supply chain just on the off chance that there's a conflict where well, China, to not put too fine a point on it, would say no more materials for batteries to Western nations, and we'd be in huge trouble. And so a lot of that investment is trying to overcome this point source of a globally important commodity. And I think it's a great place to be investing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also an interesting piece of the point I make about the critical minerals is that people throw out the stats about on average across the upstream to downstream supply chain, China controls around 75 to 85% of the critical minerals. The issue is not that China controls it. The issue is that by controlling it, you get all of the cost efficiencies of vertical supply chain.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world has like these little lateral supply chain agreements that do not give them the same kind of cost savings. So, like, yes, there's some part of this that is still a geopolitical argument, but it's also a matter of verticalizing the supply chains, and you have to create new agreements to get better prices on the different parts of the process.
Yeah, you're certainly right about that. The other thing that's really interesting is I hear people complain a lot about how China's not following the rules of the game, right? In doing this verticalization. The thing is that I think that what they don't understand is that we're just playing the two different kinds of football, right? They have like American football versus soccer. They have totally different rules. And China is not moving forward as a nation thinking that, oh, at every stage we have to be able to make money. What the government is doing is saying, no, no, we have to just win. And winning can happen at whatever price that is. And that's why you see that the Chinese government is outperforming the US government, the European Union at simply blanket investment in the verticalization of the supply chain, as you said, fundamental research, because they're not arguing about are we playing nice in the open market. They're just saying we're investing government funding and a lot of government funding, many, 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 many billions of dollars every year. into making sure that we have full access to materials, full access to raw materials, full access to the processability and then cell manufacturing. And this has been a sustained effort in China for a decade or 2 decades. And that's
Two and a
why
half, yep.
this is why people say they're winning. They're just like, they showed up with a soccer ball and we showed up with football pads on, and we're just complaining that they don't want to play our game. I think if we really want to overcome as a Western consortium of nations, we're going to have to beat them at their own game. And I think that's totally possible. You just have to get people to think about the ecosystem much, much differently than we have about other things.
Correct. And that's actually part of why I think the battery belt is important, is because we have to think across state lines in order to achieve similar levels of scale, just like scale and integration. The other thing I'll add on that point is when you look at the global automotive sales and the folks who are at the top, I think part of the reason why Hyundai is one of the only top three global automotive that gained share last year in terms of global automotive sales is because they also do a really good job of vertical integration, right? Like they own who makes their seatbelts. They also own who makes their car seats. It's like you have Hyundai, Globus, Mobis, Transys. They fully, it's really fascinating to see. But there are certain companies who have figured this out and are doing it well, and it's why they're maintaining their global share. And I'm really excited to see how that plays out because it's why Hyundai and Toyota are in the top three of the global automotive sales right now, and Ford, GM, and Stellantis are kind of struggle busing a little bit, to
Yeah,
be
I think you're right. Like,
perfectly
so
honest.
I'm not going to say that I'm a fan of monopolies, but like, there's one way to, like, you could have called the same thing a verticalization of supply chain as a monopoly. But I think we've systematically, whether it's some of the automotive manufacturers, whether it's telecom like AT&T, for example, like how many times have we broken them up into pieces to avoid what you're calling verticalization? If we were in an economics class, someone would make the argument pro and con. But I think in this particular instance, I mean, you're certainly right that as long as there's still competition in the market, which there is, prices can come pretty low. And we know right now, I mean, battery prices are extremely low.
Right, right. On that same vein, do you think that if federal funding continues to prioritize, defense readiness and critical mineral security, where should universities be focusing their battery research efforts in light of that? Because we're seeing some of that happening.
Mhm.
Um, and it's an interesting question of where we as universities should be thinking about focusing our battery research in light of that.
Yeah, great. So as someone who like runs a battery institute at a university, right? So I'm going to put on my selfish hat here for just a minute and say, where we are helping, right? So let's take just new chemistries out of this, right? Because if we think about critical mineral security, we're still talking about the same collection of materials as we were talking before. So some of the ways that universities can really help, I think one is significantly reducing or finding new processes and technologies to significantly reduce the energy input, the water input for recycling technologies. I know that at USC, just to speak selfishly again, we have programs, some of them funded by the Department of War, that really focus in this particular area. And how do you get away from or even improve hydrometallurgical processes, right, which are notoriously energy intense and water intense, right?
You connect on that because we also have someone in chemistry here, Dr. Tina Salguero, who's also looking at the metallurgical battery elements processing piece as well.
Yeah,
So let me know and we'll connect you.
yeah, that would be great to do. And even as part of that, like there are things that are left over inside of like critical minerals where even if you recovered those, that you might find rare earth elements, you might find noble metals. Copper is another thing that is super, super important to get, right, for copper foils and so on. And we have the only North American supplier of of copper foil in South Carolina, Camden Copper, which, those folks are great. We met with them a number of times. So I think certainly on the recycling side, that's one area. But then you think about how do you take these recovered materials, whether through direct or indirect recycling, and form them back into battery materials, and what's the material science that goes into like actually building a crystal structure that you're interested in, chemical process. So there's sort of the front end and back end, and in the middle, you need somebody who's going to demonstrate that you can make commercial grade cells. And you're really not going to, at the beginning of these processes, develop 30 kilograms, 30,000 kilograms of material. Someone's going to have, 500 grams. They need someone to build cells by hand. Then they're going to have 20 grams or 20 kilograms and need somebody to have a manufacturing process where they do that. And that's another place that universities can play a really significant role, is in this pilot and pre-pilot scale where you can demonstrate the full supply chain in the United States. And once people start to see that, whether it's all in South Carolina, selfishly, sorry, I know you're in Georgia, or the Southeast more broadly, that's a great story to be able to tell. And as many success stories as we can, the better. And I think universities are going to play a role in those three critical areas. And when we think about what we're doing on that in the Carolina Institute for Battery Innovation, that's frankly why we're doing what we're doing in a number of different levels. Is just this vision that these are the three things that we definitely need to be helping industry and government agencies to figure out.
Definitely, definitely. To that vein, what do you think is the biggest misconception about scaling battery innovation from lab to manufacturing, or lab to market, or bench to market? People call this several different things, or
Yeah.
getting it out of the TRL 1 to 4 hole.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we said the valley of death before. So the first thing is how actually difficult this is. It is incredibly hard, and it's not just the valley of death, but it really is. I think first of all, as a professor, professors, I'll speak on behalf of all of us, are generally bad at understanding what manufacturing really is. I mean, there are some that are experts in this, but they're not usually battery materials people. There are some folks and they've come to us at CB and said, hey, we'd love for you guys to make some cells for us. Can we send you like 50 grams or 500 milligrams? And to say like, no, you need to send us 50 kilograms in order to manufacture real cells. I think there's a gap there. And actually getting from 500 milligrams to 5 grams is a gap, right? That's like TRL 1, 2 to TRL 4. And then to get to TRL 7, you got to be making tens of kilograms. And then to TRL 9 is thousands of kilograms. And there are reasons that aren't even foundational to the chemistry or the material itself that stops you from moving between TRLs. There are synthesis problems. There's scalability issues that industrial engineers have to try to figure out. And there are problems that actually emerge 10 years after development that make a material set either less shelf stable and you couldn't see it coming at TRL2 and those sorts of things. There's all kinds of reasons why we have been making, very similar like NMC graphite for, so long. It's because it is one collection of materials that we know work super well together, and we haven't found I don't want to speak out of turn. It's not that we haven't found any other ones, but it's just so difficult to overcome all of the things that you can't see at TRL2. It is not, it's a miracle when you get from TRL2 to TRL9.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like a miracle. I honestly think batteries are kind of magic is kind of my analogy. The more I learn about them, because I come into this being an infrastructure expert, not a battery expert. But when the cars decided that they were going to be based on batteries, I kind of had to learn a lot about the batteries, and I still think they're just kind of magical, honestly.
Yeah, I will say though, like we talk about batteries as this new thing. Some of the very, very first cars were battery powered, right?
This is true.
People strapping
Ford,
Danielle cells to carts. It was a
yes,
thing.
Henry Ford's wife used to drive a EV,
Yes,
actually.
that is correct.
Yeah. Because she had access to some of the very first EVs for
Yep.
obvious reasons. Um, so moving more closely into the chemistry manufacturing strategy world, when capacity shifts from vehicles to stationary storage, you mentioned this a little bit, but would love to answer this really cleanly. What exactly changes technically? Because I think it's important for us to answer that for the audience. I don't think it's chemistry because we covered that. But is it pack architecture, safety profile? Is there any degradation assumptions that change when you're not making an EV battery anymore and it's now for a stationary storage application instead?
Yeah, I think first of all, you're totally right. I mean, it's really not chemistry, not explicitly. You are going to see a lot of competition chemistry wise because the energy density doesn't have to be quite as high. Although that's also overblown because some folks will say, oh, we need to switch to this other technology because it's cheaper but doesn't have the energy density. But then people come back and say, no, just because we want to containerize them doesn't mean energy density is not important. So materials, yeah, definitely, or chemistry are super, super similar. There are a number of things, though, that really become important. So how you think about safety is very different. So in an EV, how you cool a battery and what the operating thermal range is and where the heat comes from and where it goes is fundamentally different than it is in an energy storage system where you have a containerized racks that really sit openly in the heat of summer. I mean, we live in the South, right? We know how hot it gets. So you have to really think about like how do you vent that container? How do you control the atmosphere passively so that way you don't have these complicated HVAC systems that
Which
necessarily.
a lot of them seem to have very complex HVAC and fan cooling systems currently, from what someone explained to me,
Yeah,
is the
and
current
that yeah,
answer.
I think that's one of these efficiency gains that are going to happen. And I think right now that's to manage safety, right? Because you know that you don't want a battery sitting at 50 C in the South Carolina or Georgia sun in the middle of August, right? And that leads into like degradation, venting. The other side of safety is how do you teach like first responders to interact with a BESS system that probably is undergoing a thermal runaway event or one of the cells versus an EV? So how you would approach and deal with that is all very, very different. So I think that's why when you think about like transitioning, like the safety component is very different, which means that how the systems are designed, how large the modules can be, how you deal with heating and cooling, those are all fundamentally different. And so you don't see a lot of people just say, "Oh, I'm going to take this rack that was for an EV or a module, and I'm just going to put it in the rack for a stationary system." So when that does happen, they are modular and outside as opposed to built to be inside. So I think that's the biggest issue is like it's almost like a 9-volt battery is maybe as an analogy that the audience would understand even easier is that a 9-volt battery is actually just six quadruple A batteries wired together. Generally, so some of them aren't cylindrical, but if you were to do an X-ray like 3D computed tomography, and I've seen these of a 9-volt battery, it is six quad A batteries that are just aligned or in series, right? And that's the difference is that yeah, you could buy quadruple A individual cells, or you could buy a 9-volt battery that has them arranged slightly differently, and they perform slightly differently in those two environments. And I think that's very hopefully that's a good analogy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's how I explain it to people as well when I'm explaining what's going on in your Nissan Leaf battery versus battery energy storage situation. I guess on that same vein, how do you think Southeast battery belt manufacturers should be thinking about LFP, which tends to be the most popular chemistry right now, versus other chemistries in storage positioning?
Yeah, so I think the big question mark with any of these sort of people that are competing with LFP in storage, whether it's NMC, sodium ion, or LFP, I think the decision at the end of the day, people are going to make around safety. Now, I'm not going to put my neck in the guillotine and say which one I think is the safest one of those three because I've been even at NatBat last week. Stan Whittingham got up and said some things about the relative safety of these that, look, he's the Nobel Prize winner, not me, but it got a lot of people talking. So,
Listen, I
um,
was hoping you would bring up NatBat at some point, and I'm glad you did here.
yeah, so yeah, we were there last week and Stan really like started a howl, with people comparing sodium and lithium, traditional NMC with LFP. So I'm not gonna go on the limb. Maybe if I win the Nobel Prize next year, which I'm not gonna do, then I'll say whatever I want to say. But
I have big
um,
dreams for you on this Nobel Prize in
well,
chemistry.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Gabby. I appreciate it. You and my sister, I think, are the two people rooting for me. But anyway, so in terms of the Southeast, I think we're going to make this decision around safety because we said before a lot of the growth in the Southeast right now and in the nation is in this data center gigawatt hour scale. And the last thing that we need to see on the news is a gigawatt hour scale fire. And people are going to be very sensitive about this because even though it's a very rare event, every time a gas-powered car sets fire, every time that a traditional fuel station sets on fire, it's on the local news. Every time you have any battery fire now, it's on the national news.
International news, international, yeah. Because
Yeah.
there's some real sensationalism about it because it's just unfamiliar. Even though the gas vehicles catch fire more often than the EVs. Like
Yeah.
this is something we covered in our demystifying EV fire safety series
Yep.
last summer, just kind of explaining what actually goes on there and the real differences in fire incidence rates, where like EV fire incidence rates are universally very low globally.
Yeah, exactly. And it's even if you get outside of the vehicle, I mean, just think about like at traditional like energy generation sources. So like there are fires that are just a result of leakage out of natural gas um uh 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 natural gas like infrastructure, right? And we don't talk about that if a pipe is leaking, right, and it has a fire sticking out of it, it's not on the national news. If one out of 100,000 modules for a gigafactory is on fire, suddenly it takes national and international news. So I think because of that, you're going to see a lot of people making safety-based decisions. And they're also going to install, and like you talked about, some of these more complicated air conditioning systems are meant around safety. Also, the fire suppression is advancing pretty rapidly as well. And even if you have a fire inside of one of these, there are some folks taking steps to even make sure that there's not this massive smoke that's billowing outside where you can see it. And I totally understand that because you don't want to lose a PR battle, that someone's going to politicize when really it's incredibly safe and reliable.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So I just have a couple of questions left to close us out. One, we can't end the podcast without talking more about the Carolina Institute for Battery Innovation. That would be just really sad. So would love for you to tell us more about how CIBI, really does all sorts of things to bridge research, pilot scale workforce readiness differently from a traditional academic lab.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate because now I get my 5 minute commercial right for CB, so I
Yes.
appreciate that.
Now you give us the pitch,
All right,
right?
great. So, all right, so the big picture of the pitch is that we want anyone, whether it's South Carolina, the Southeast, or the US, when you think about battery research, education, or manufacturing, you think of the Carolina Institute for Battery Innovation. And you might think, why? Like, what's so special about the University of South Carolina? And I mean, frankly, it's that we've been investing in batteries for over 40 years already. We hired the first faculty for batteries in 1984. That has grown to 19 faculty today. We also are hiring our 20th faculty member. We might have to throw him or her a party just for being another nice round number. But then you take the dozens of graduate students, undergraduates, postdocs. It's about 100 people working on batteries, which means for us that when you come visit us, thinking about batteries and doing research at Carolina is not like At a lot of other universities, it would be like you talking to me, and I'm a dude with a glove box. Like I'm super interested in like fundamental research, and we're working on a paper right now for like the SEI on silicon when you make slight chemistry changes in the PAA binder. Like we're writing that kind of stuff in my group. And so you can go from that, and we certainly have faculty that work from there, but we go all the way to people who are making, building inverters for BESS systems in their lab, folks that are doing digital twins for implementation of batteries and supercapacitors on Navy ships. We do safety testing. I mean, there's a huge variety of people. So from a research perspective, I mean, there's a lot of people working on a lot of problems. So we're kind of ready as a team to respond to that. From an educational perspective, we have a new graduate certificate in battery science and engineering that we're starting to offer. We have a minor that's going to be coming online as well. We're working with the South Carolina Technical College system and Siemens on augmented and virtual reality tools. So, I mean, that stuff is like innovating in the classroom and really doing workforce readiness in South Carolina. And then the thing that has been missing over 4 decades is this thing that lets us go all the way from conception to implementation and deployment, which is the manufacturing piece. So we're building a 100,000 square foot facility on our campus specifically for batteries. And of course, a lot of the R&D we're talking about is going to be going there. But in 2026, either at the end of this year or the very beginning of 27, we're going to be taking occupancy of a 20,000 square foot facility where we're doing pilot scale manufacturing. So we're going to be able to make 1,200 pouch and cylindrical cells. The pouch cells will be 5 and or 10 amp hour sort of nominally. Of course, chemistry matters and all that kind of stuff. And then 21,700 cells as well. So we're sort of taking this a concept of, yes, we have the brain power, yes, we work in applications, but now we're going to be the proving ground for companies in the region and the nation to prove out their technology. And that's maybe the reason that folks are interested on the call. Get in touch with me, whether you want to know more about the research side and collaborate on fundamentals or applications. Or also, please reach out to me if you're interested in getting in the queue to start manufacturing with us when we get up and running in just a few months.
Amazing, amazing. It's very exciting that so many universities are putting in battery facilities like this. Because I've heard similar updates from, I don't know if you've met the Alabama Mobility and Power Center folks, the AMP folks who are also trying to build out their battery lab to do something similar. Because honestly, there's just a lot of work that needs to get done regionally for the Southeast battery belt. So I'm glad
Yeah.
that we're building and investing in all these resources as our region.
Yeah, I agree with that. And really there's a need for it. And of course the OG place is the University of Michigan and Greg Less's team over there. And in fact, Greg has helped CB a lot. In fact, we've worked with him as a consultant. He and I are talking every week as we get our operation up and running. So he's been a great resource. And so he's been a really good friend. And I think that right now you're in this time where there's really not competition explicitly between these universities because they all have either a unique twist on what they're offering or they have a different customer or a different type of customer that they want to service.
Oh
Some
yeah,
like, yeah, some
because
like in
as you
Ohio.
know, you want that kind of research to be happening nearby because it matters for the distance, for the logistics of all of this.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're going to end up with these centers of regional excellence. Of course, being in Carolina, I hope that CB is the best one of those centers of regional excellence. But I know the people that are doing New Energy New York. In fact, it was me, the folks from NENY, the folks from RIT. We had dinner at NatBat last week, and we're talking about, okay,
Okay.
what are you doing, and what do you have online, and with Greg helping us. And then, of course, other folks around the country as well, like the University of Texas, Dallas, right? I've been in contact with those people as well. So right now, we are all talking to each other. And frankly, most of us are playing very nice, understanding that instead of competing with each other, can we find a way to make a network of these pilot operations where we each know what we do best And we sort of guide each other and guide customers to the right place to work, not try to sort of hold everybody in for ourselves. And I think that's going to help us be more successful, is just being collaborative and open.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think we need the knowledge sharing. It's still enough of a nation in industry where there's so much that needs to get done. My last question for you, is 5 years from now, right? What will we wish we understood earlier about the role of storage and grid evolution, but then also kind of what the biggest gap going on today between battery research and scaled manufacturing in the Southeast. It's like crystal ball, where do you think we need to go next across all of these things we talked about today?
So I'm gonna maybe be slightly controversial and not pick a battery thing. I'm gonna say that I think the answer to that really lies in grid infrastructure, because right now and over the next few years, all of the behind the meter stuff we talked about earlier is gonna sort of mask this massive increase in real-time demand, because you can sort of temporarily offset it, but that reaches a limit, right? That you can only do that for
Yes.
so long. You can only buy so many cheap electrons before they're expensive. And so I
Correct.
think we're either going to look back and wish that we use this opportunity to invest and bolster the grid infrastructure, or we're going to be very thankful that we did.
Exactly. This is actually something I've been bringing up, but from a slightly different angle, where a lot of people have been, crying doom and gloom because of the announcements on the battery manufacturer side about pivoting to battery energy storage. And I've been saying, I'm like, EV community, we should be excited about this because in many places in the country, the grid infrastructure was a bottleneck for charging infrastructure growth. And EV demand alone was not enough to push the utility grids to upgrade. But the data centers have a lot of money and are growing so quickly that it actually might be the push that gets the grid infrastructure to grow and get updated and fully built out, where we've been having all these issues of like transformers with 72-week delays and all sorts of madness that were a real structural bottleneck for EV charging growth. That might actually fix our demand problem organically on the EV side because we'll fix our EV infrastructure problem as the EV charging infrastructure has continued to grow anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right, because we went from talking about billions to trillions. And so we're not like, EVs aren't necessarily in the noise, but EVs certainly, I think, can benefit from piggybacking on all of the grid infrastructure that gets put in to support data centers. And one of the real differences here is that when you think about the EV investments, all the discussion around how do you make it cheaper? Well, when it's not cheaper, you pass the cost to the consumer, right? The person who bought the vehicle. In this particular case, we're talking about the cost being the burden of the cost being taken on by the folks who want the data centers. So now, Bill Mustaine and Gabby Pierre are not the ones paying for the infrastructure. It's Google and Microsoft and all of those companies, and their pockets are deeper than ours for sure.
Exactly. It's like the data centers are probably going to pay for the grid infrastructure updates that the utilities needed anyway. Bill, this has been an incredibly helpful conversation in reframing batteries beyond the vehicle and into a broader infrastructure and competitive lens and era. As electrification matures, storage may be less about the headlines and more about flexibility, resilience, and strategic capacity planning, as we discussed. Thank you for joining us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning and plugging in. We'll continue exploring how the battery belt evolves as manufacturing, grid infrastructure, and research converge in the future.
Thank you for listening, and follow the Battery Belt podcast for more on how the American Southeast is shaping the future of mobility, innovation, industry, and everyday life.